1987, Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility, Department of State, Washington, D.C. The door to the skiff slid closed with an airtight swoosh. While it was unlikely a spy could penetrate deep into the basement of the State Department building and plant a bug there, the U.S. took every precaution when it came to protecting its most sensitive information. The Secretary of State's voice sounded oddly muffled, as did all the other sounds inside the skiff, thanks to the secretive silencing technology employed to prevent any outside eavesdropping. The sound insulation was so good that pre-recorded noises of ventilation at low volume had to be played to prevent significant mental effects from the extreme silence that would otherwise overwhelm anyone inside the room. From the outside, there wasn't even a hint of vibration caused by sound waves inside to prevent even advanced laser-based eavesdropping devices from working. I want options on the table, both kinetic and non-kinetic, to take to the president. You have exactly 10 minutes. The Secretary of State sat, though he didn't bother to remove his jacket. The 10-minute threat was all too real. The first to respond was a representative from the Joint Chiefs. The situation was still evolving and information was scarce. This meeting was but one of several similar meetings currently taking place across the highest levels of the American government. The one-star Army general was unfazed by the Secretary's rush. He hadn't made it this high up the chain of command by giving in to pressure. Mr. Secretary, hard-on-the-ground intelligence is still being accumulated as we speak. We know that at least 5 people have been taken, and 1 is suspected to have been killed. The situation is uncertain. Might have been an escape attempt, perhaps in the initial struggle. Surviving victims include a mother and father and their 2 teenage children. A specialist from the State Department's Hostage Crisis Team, a recently established office given the spike in international kidnappings of American and partner country nationals, interrupted. We're in contact with the family stateside now, still developing the full picture. We have photos and even some home movies for the press soon, but it sounds like the family was on vacation. What's the host nation's response? The Secretary of State was poring over a printout highlighting what the hostage team had gathered so far on the family. It would all be used to construct a plan on what to do next. The press would be given photos and footage of the family. Having home movies was a big help. Hostage rescue was as much a matter of negotiation as the use of force and outright propaganda to garner sympathy. The family was on vacation in Angola, got snatched up from one of the coastal resorts. Iron Eagle's claiming responsibility. The hostage team representative handed out photos of the family he'd printed out. The family was mixed. The father was white and the mother black, with 2 children whose features made it obvious they were mixed. It was easy to see why the Iron Eagle, an extremist Nazi terrorist group, had targeted them. The group was on a self-imposed crusade against what they called the, quote, mongrel races of the world. Unsatisfied with the status quo reached between the Third Reich and the United States in the wake of the 2-week war, Iron Eagle had exploded in popularity inside the Reich. They took on their government's campaign for purity outside the borders of the Reich, or sometimes inside of it, given that it hadn't taken long for Germany to realize if it exterminated everyone who wasn't Aryan enough in occupied territories, there would be nobody left to work in their factories and their industry would collapse. For anyone affiliated with Iron Eagle, though, this was an unacceptable compromise, and attacks even inside the Reich against minority populations were common. Now it was the one-star general's turn to interrupt. They crossed the border 16 hours ago. We got good intel on where they holed up as of 10 hours ago. Might still be there. Satellite was retasked for an overflight, and we got some good photos thanks to the clear weather. The general handed out his own printout, this time satellite imagery of what appeared to be a remote and now defunct plantation just miles from the Angola border. After the Second World War, Germany had taken over the Belgian Congo and instituted a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign. This was what led to the realization that the Germans couldn't simply murder everyone, as there'd be nobody left to work. Still, this realization came too late in the case of the Congo, and subsequently many of the country's once extremely productive plantations and mines were abandoned. What help can we get from the Krauts? This time, the secretary's question was aimed at a member of the diplomatic staff assigned to the Third Reich. The young man seemed overwhelmed at first. It was obvious that this was his first time in such a high-level meeting. But given the flurry of diplomatic efforts currently underway, he seemed to be the only member with a high enough clearance that the team could spare to send. Gathering himself, he cleared his throat and answered the secretary's question. Yes, sir. We're not getting much. The Germans say they don't have enough law enforcement presence in the borderlands to be of much help. Bullshit! There was a general scoff around the room, but the outburst came from the head of the hostage crisis team. We know they use these groups. They might as well be an extension of Berlin itself. That being so, they're even more unlikely to help with a negotiation or a rescue effort. The young diplomat looked apologetic. The rest of the room, however, were the stoic masks of men with decades of the highest echelons of power. Negotiation directly with the Iron Eagle is off the table. President will never go for that. And it violates our own deterrence policy. So unless someone has any leverage we can apply on the Reich itself, I want to hear the kinetic options. There was silence around the room until a representative from the Department of Commerce spoke up. We could threaten significant sanctions on electronic chips. China would only be too happy to comply, given tensions in South Asia. The Reich produces their own, but none of the highest quality. Us, the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese provide nearly 90% of the advanced chips they use. The secretary nodded. This was an answer he liked, and it had been something he'd been pressuring the president on for months. Everyone knew the future was digital, and locking the Reich out of that future, or at least slowing their ascension to it, was a matter of vital national interest in the secretary's opinion. Plus, a lot of new American military hardware depended heavily on ever more powerful electronics. He saw no reason why the United States should be helping equip its chief rival. Perfect. Now let's talk kinetic options. The secretary turned toward the one-star general and an admiral sitting next to him. He knew the rear admiral by name. The man had previously commanded an amphibious assault group stationed in American Algeria. He'd recently been transferred to Joint Special Operations Command and represented JSOC at the table today. The admiral motioned at the printouts from the latest satellite pass. We'll have an infrared bird over the site in another hour or so. Too low resolution for much detail, but a good chance we'll be able to identify human activity. To get more granular, we'll need something overhead. The one-star general interrupted. That'd be a problem. Might be a border area, but it's still well within the German air defense network. After the war, given the success of our air forces, they doubled down in the region. There's no chance of getting eyes up there without permission from the Germans. We have some capability to penetrate German skies. The admiral's face remained blank, despite the raising of eyebrows across the room, including intensely denied airspace, for a short time. I'm afraid we'll have to discuss the details in a different briefing, with the properly cleared personnel. Given the disappointment on many of the faces of the skiff, including the Army general, not many here would be a part of that meeting. The secretary nodded knowingly. He wasn't clear on the details, but he's heard rumors that the United States had some sort of aircraft, or multiple types of aircraft, that were extremely difficult to track and spot. The admiral continued his briefing. We could likely insert a rescue team via halo and wingsuits from a drop inside of Angola airspace, have them land at the border and thus keep the delivery aircraft well within Angola to avert suspicion from German radar surveillance. They can trek the 10 or so miles in. Problem's extraction. There's no telling how many Iron Eagles are within rapid response range. Smart money is they'd have at least 2 or 3 rapid response teams at squad size or more. We've confirmed they have enough manpower in the area to conduct patrols and raids on local communities across the border. Even flying low, helicopters are going to be a problem. Air defense is bound to eventually pick them up. We could use Rangers. The one-star suggestion was not a bad one, though sending in half a company of Army Rangers would basically trigger a second war with the Reich, as it'd be impossible to keep covert. The secretary shook his head emphatically. No, this needs to be as quiet as possible. Delta, SEALs, Special Activities, we need a small team that can get in and out with as little noise as possible, at least initially. We can make a bang on the way out as long as we don't give the Reich any diplomatic ammo to shoot at the president. Your means of penetrating German airspace, can it deliver fire support? The admiral's expressionless mask never shifted. I can better answer that question at a separate briefing, Mr. Secretary. In America's vast black world, its extensive secret defense industry and military operations, that answer was as good as a confirmation. Some of the meeting's attendees, those without the required clearances, looked impressed. America couldn't just penetrate German air defenses, it might even be able to destroy them. That would have been a handy capability in the 2-week war a decade ago. Fine then. The secretary rose, gathering what few things he had brought into the skiff with him. The rest of the room rose with him, recognizing the meeting was over and preparing for the scramble to get back to their respective departments and agencies to arrange contingencies for other possible scenarios. I'll brief the president with what we got so far. Those of you heading up to the big house with me, you know who you are, can take my motorcade. We're leaving in 5. The room scrambled into action, a few of the senior people in it moving with much greater sense of urgency than the rest. 5 minutes was barely enough time to clear the multiple security checkpoints between the basement skiff and the garage. Berlin, Third Reich. Irma's day had been bad, as they tended to be more often than not lately. She fumed internally over a normally insignificant spat with a coworker that blew up out of proportion due to the stress of so many things seemingly going wrong all at once. That's probably why she didn't hear the figure coming up behind her. as she was walking to her car on the 3rd floor of the hospital parking lot. The ski-masked figure snatched her from behind and threw their hand over her mouth. A second figure rushed up and painfully stabbed the barrel of a handgun into her ribs. "Scream and I'll shoot." Irma did try to scream, though it was an instinctual move. The hand over her mouth tightened and the pistol pushed more painfully into her side. A trained spy or a military special operator might have realized then and there that the gunman had no real intention to shoot her, and would have probably known that in these kinds of situations, they usually don't. But Irma wasn't a trained spy or special operator. She was a 32-year-old senior nurse with a failing marriage and a 3rd miscarriage in as many years. A vehicle Irma couldn't quite see behind her hurried up to them and stopped with a squeal, followed by a sound of a door opening and hushed shouts of "Get her in! Get her in!" Again, had she been anyone with any level of training, she would have probably realized these people were not professionals, and she might have been better served simply to try to fight her way out. They likely wouldn't want the attention that a murder would bring them. Irma was shoved into the vehicle, and an unseen figure placed a sack over her head. There wasn't much talking as the vehicle sped away. Irma could feel the vehicle take 3 curved ramps that took the vehicle to street level, speeding away into the busy thoroughfare directly in front of the hospital. She still wasn't a trained specialist, but she was clever. Clever enough to know that the interior windows must be heavily tinted, as she felt no glare from the sun, and clever enough to start a mental timer of each turn they made. That way, she might be able to approximate how far away these people were taking her and in what direction. The bag was ripped off her head suddenly, and Irma was right. The vehicle was in fact heavily tinted. She was sitting in the back seat between 2 masked figures. The driver up front was unmasked, but the rearview mirror was turned so she couldn't see his face. The passenger, a smaller female Irma guessed, was masked. She shoved several photographs into her hands. "Look at these." Irma didn't need the invitation. The photographs horrified her, and the implication of the photographs horrified her even more. "What do you see?" the masked female asked her. People at a hospital? I don't know." "No, what do you see? Tell me exactly what's going on in each photograph." Irma stammered, not out of fear. All fear over her kidnapping had vanished over the horror of what she held. And the excitement? It was an open secret after all. But nobody outside of the various medical programs knew really what went on, and nobody had any hard proof. Irma was holding in her hands the power to expose the truth about the entire Nazi medical enterprise to the world. She began to describe the photograph that was currently at the top. It's a man. His body has been separated into various marked areas. Looks like limbs and locations of major organs. Some of these are burned, some only a little. Others show clear signs of 3rd-degree burning. It's disgusting. The woman, maybe a girl, thought Irma based on her voice, couldn't be older than 25, nodded her approval. "Next one." Irma flipped the photo to the next one. It's a child, maybe 3 years old. He's bound up and submerged in water. I recognize several different steroids on the table next to him. Some we use to help attempt to restart the heart after cardiac arrest. "Good, next photo." And on the girl demanded until Irma had described each one of the horrible 32 photos in her hands. A litany of crimes against humanity. "And what do you think?" Irma knew what she thought, because it was a thought that had germinated throughout her first real hospital experience during the 2-week war 12 years ago. She remembered a horribly burned young soldier and a nurse happily musing that a recently developed treatment would likely help him greatly. It did. The results were nearly miraculous, with nearly fully restored use of a limb so badly damaged it would have normally been amputated. The scarring had not been as severe as expected. The treatment had been Jew medicine, the miracle of the Reich, the reason why it was the most medically advanced nation on Earth, decades ahead of the world. The use of Jews and others in medical experimentation was an open secret in the Reich, something the first generation born after the war had politely ignored. The second generation simply shrugged it off, and the third considered the situation to have been completely blown out of proportion. Sure, there were human trials, but the people involved knew what they were doing and were compensated accordingly. With the information ministry's iron grip on all media, the truth had been impossible to expose, despite numerous attempts to do so. All anybody had to show for the effort was personal testimony that state media laughed off before the individual was arrested for inciting unrest. Until today. The girl in the passenger seat didn't wait for Irma's answer. She could read it on her face. "We've got contacts all over. Scouted you out a while ago. Married, but barren or infertile. No children after years of trying. Husband's career suffering for his failure to create more Aryan heirs for the Great Reich, and yours too. You should be a doctor, but there was never quite room for you in the advanced training programs, was there? You're unerwünscht. Unerwünscht. Unwanted. It was a slang term used by the Germans to refer to individuals who were not seen as materially or culturally contributing to the Reich's greatness. It was one step above being an inferior race, and there were rumors that Unerwünscht were eventually relocated to labor camps for the purity of the Reich. You want to actually do something with your life? Irma did. The next day, she returned to work, a smile on her face for the first time in months. Her marriage was still in shambles. A divorce would be the final nail in both their social coffins. She still hated her job and increasingly her role in society. But for the first time, she could remember she had a goal now. Andrews Air Force Base. Redacted. Dark Star on Overwatch. The voice over the speakers was coming via satellite feed from thousands of miles away, as was the video being projected onto a large white wall. It was grainy, low resolution, but undeniably a miracle of modern technology. For the first time in history, a U.S. president could sit courtside to an ongoing and highly secret military operation. It was all possible thanks to the extensive communications gear inside the classified basement office deep in the heart of Andrews Air Force Base. So far, the president was so impressed that he would immediately push for these capabilities to be moved directly to the White House. Even via Marine One, Andrews was too far away to handle emergencies. The assembled group of the president's senior-most cabinet members, as well as the communication staff cleared to run the place, had been watching the mission unfold via grainy thermal footage for the last hour or so. The vehicle delivering this feed via line-of-sight link to an orbiting communications plane and then satellite straight to Andrews was one of the Air Force's most secretive platforms, a stealthy, unmanned drone known as Dark Star. Drones were nothing new, and the F-117 and B-2 bomber had been introduced to the world years before, but nobody thought the technology could be miniaturized to this extent yet, or the drone's flying wing shape flyable with such a small body. And it wasn't. It was incredibly unstable. But advances in fly-by-wire technology and computers made the drone possible. As far as any German radar operators knew, there was nothing in their skies, save for an occasional very weak track that would be chalked down to equipment malfunction. Dark Star flew lazily over the mission site, a seemingly abandoned plantation just over the border from friendly Angola in Reich territory. 2 thermal birds, or satellites in intelligence speak, had overflown the site and confirmed activity anywhere between 8 and 14 individuals. Dark Star had a much lower resolution due to a smaller optics package, but allowed for persistent and real-time monitoring. The stealth drone had been over the target site for 3 hours before the SEAL team had reached the perimeter, confirming at least 12 individuals, not counting the hostages believed to be inside. The SEALs were clearly visible, making their break out of the tree line, moving in pairs from cover to cover. While the rest of the team provided overwatch, 2 SEALs moved up. At 3 different points along the perimeter, snipers had taken positions. The president wasn't privy to the SEALs' communications. Those would be local to avoid the possibility of radio intercepts, but the men appeared to be moving like a well-oiled machine. The president had no power over the men on the ground anymore. They would act on their own judgment. This was the investment the nation had made in them. All he could do was watch as the carefully planned ambush played out on the screen. The snipers were the first to open up, eliminating targets inside the main building where the drone couldn't see. Their rifles were silenced as best as possible, buying the SEALs a few moments of confusion before the general alarm was raised. But those seconds were all they needed. In brutal efficiency, 5 personnel outside the plantation were eliminated. Seemed like no more than a few seconds after that, the assault element had breached the plantation home. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The few minutes went by slowly, placing an incredible strain on the nerves of everyone assembled. Finally, a figure exited the home. With such low resolution, it was impossible to tell if it was friend or foe, but the figure activated an electronic beacon, which let off a steady pulse of infrared light for 30 seconds. This was how the SEALs communicated mission success to the drone loitering above. The room erupted into cheers and backclapping, but shortly after, the men's attention was drawn back to the screen. The drone had slewed its camera upwards to observe a road leading up to the plantation. Several vehicles were clearly visible speeding down the road. Slewing toward a second road on the other side, more vehicles were visible. They were distinctly civilian vehicles, not armored military ones, which was a slight relief even as the icy grip of terror gripped the assembled men. It was a trap. The president's men raced. The Reich had baited him expertly with the kidnapping, and to avoid being directly involved, had outsourced the attack to their Iron Eagle contacts. The Iron Eagle had been all too happy for the opportunity to kill Americans, especially a whole team of its most elite soldiers. Now, the Reich would not just get to embarrass the US internationally, but it had the ammo it needed to escalate tensions with America and its allies. Even after careful investigation by both sides, nobody really knew who or what had started the two-week war. Tensions were sky-high along the border areas between the Reich and the US and its allies. Any number of small incidents could suddenly escalate the conflict. Despite the destruction both sides had scored on the other, the conflict had ended before being in any way decisive, and luckily before it had escalated to something worse. But history would know exactly who was to blame for the next war: the American president. 16 SEALs and what appeared to be 4 hostages were making their way to the tree line, but they'd never reach it in time. And if they did, what appeared to be 9 vehicles full of Iron Eagle fighters would easily catch them. "Sir, I need orders." The Secretary of Defense had to shake the president back to the present. The president looked confused, dazed, so the secretary repeated himself. "Friendly Hawk needs orders, sir. We can engage, slow down the pursuers, maybe get our boys home alive, but I need orders now." Friendly Hawk was an F-117 flying Overwatch miles behind Dark Star. It was serving as a communications link for the drone, but its small weapons bay had also been loaded with ground attack munitions for exactly a worst-case scenario as this. The Germans wouldn't have a chance in hell of catching the stealth plane, but dropping live ordnance on their territory would only add fuel to the fire. But if he did nothing, the president had to decide. The video feed was delayed by 2.7 seconds, he reminded himself. "Fuck it, do it. Give them everything we got. Contact Joint Base Williams and have them put birds up in the air just in case." The SecDef didn't acknowledge. He was already issuing commands over his comlink. Thousands of miles away, the drone operator sitting in an air-conditioned trailer 100 miles over the friendly side of Angola border got to work. Dark Star's only downside was the high latency, which required the drone operator to be in the same geographic region. But in the future, the Air Force was sure they'd be able to fly whole fleets of drones from the comfort and safety of the mainland. Dark Star's targeting laser was visible on the thermal feed as it landed in the relative center of a group of armed men. The president could see them rushing, taking cover as the retreating SEALs unleashed a wall of covering fire. Somewhere a dozen miles away, the F-117's bomb bay briefly opened, ejecting a laser-guided ground attack munition. The canister's munition rocket motor burned for a few seconds, and then the weapon automatically deployed a small pair of wings. The seeker on the nose of the bomb sniffed out the Dark Star's laser, and 2 minutes later found it. While still 500 feet over its target, the munition burst open, scattering smaller submunitions over a wide area. Over the thermal feed, a series of small, bright flashes suddenly appeared, reminding the president of those cheap fireworks on a string that you'd throw in the ground and watch go off one by one. Only a few of the human figures at the target site remained moving, and Dark Star's operator was already lasing another target. The F-117 burped out a second munition, its bomb bays opening and closing, disrupting its stealth shape for a brief period, the only hint to Nazi radar operators that the aircraft was there. The US was unleashing 2 new technologies that would reshape combat forever: stealth and precision weapons. But the F-117 had an extremely limited weapon bay, and no matter how deadly precise each bomb was, the odds that at least some of the SEALs wouldn't be coming home were high. Later, when he was alone in bed, he'd allow himself to mourn the men he'd sent to their death. But for now, the president's mind was already at work on how to prevent an international political disaster. Washington, D.C., 2 days later. "Do you see this, folks? Are you paying attention to this?" Alabama Congressman Eric Johnson was in his element. In front of the cameras at the foot of the Capitol, it was the perfect backdrop. "Our failed president, a really bad failure, one of the worst, sent our brave men and women into combat to rescue hostages and got a bunch of them killed. Well, not women, no, women can't be SEALs yet, but we're looking into it. I know a lot of good, very brave women, and we're looking into it, folks." The reporters knew all about the failed raid that had resulted in the loss of 8 men and caused the worst international crisis since the 2-week war. But Johnson wasn't talking to them, he was talking through their cameras to an outraged nation, one whose anger he played like an expert pianist. Keep the message simple, obfuscate the truth, and always deflect. Never get pinned down to any solid answers. German intelligence had learned how to manipulate American mass media expertly during Johnson's brief but meteoric political career. "Germany's laughing at us, folks. We look ridiculous. And now our very bad president, honestly, he's one of the worst in the history of this great nation, is leading us straight to war. And we'll win that war because we have the best military in the world, but we don't want to fight that war. We will, if we have to, but we don't want to fight, folks. That'll be bad for a lot of people. A lot of good people on both sides will suffer." Congressman, is it true that you're considering running for president in the upcoming election? And if so, how would you handle this crisis? The plant for German intelligence had an easy time burrowing herself into the US media machine. TV producers weren't immune to the bribes of either cash or sex, and her entire fake career had all led to this exact moment, this exact question. A lot of people are talking, they're asking me, Mr. Johnson, would you please run for president? We need someone strong, Mr. Johnson. He replied, listen, this country is the worst, the weakest it's ever been, and it's all because of our no-good president. The Germans are laughing at us, the world is laughing at us. We have the best military and everyone's laughing at us. So I gotta do something, folks. People are asking me and I gotta do something. So yes, I will be running for president of this great nation in the 1988 election. Now go watch What If Germany Won World War II 1970s or check out this video instead.